LeaderCast.
This week on the Deep Leadership Podcast.
If you have an opportunity to make a change for the better, and that's really what leadership is. Leadership for me is it's not necessarily winning, making a lot of money. Those things are great, but I don't think that's what leadership means. I think leadership means service.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, I hope all is well with you today, and I'm so glad you found this podcast. Now, if you've been listening for a long time, I want to thank you for tuning in each week. The success of this podcast is because of your loyal viewership. Now, if you're new, welcome aboard. The purpose of this podcast is to build a world with better bosses, and we do that by introducing you to the greatest minds working in the leadership space. Now, our guests include authors, academics, podcasters, entrepreneurs, business leaders, military leaders, and successful leadership practitioners in a variety of industries. Our goal is to provide you with practical information to help you along your leadership path, whether you're new to leadership or you're a seasoned pro. So thank you for listening in. It's an honor to be your host and leadership guide in this journey. In today's episode, Dr. Moshik Temkin joins me to discuss his new book, Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, which explores historical examples of leadership lessons and how those lessons can be applied to modern challenges. Temkin highlights the importance of effective communication, especially during times of rapid change, as well as the complex relationship between leaders and the circumstances that shape them. He provides examples of unlikely leaders who have emerged in crises and examines the need for critical thinking and a willingness to step up and lead when the opportunity arises. If you're like me and are fascinated with what history can teach us about leadership, you're going to love this episode. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Leadership. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former Cold War submarine officer who spent 20 plus years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Are you ready for some real-world actionable advice from John as well as his expert guests?
I'm ready.
The show starts right now.
Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Moshik Temkin. Moshik is a distinguished visiting professor of leadership and history at Schwarzman College and a fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He has taught at Harvard University, Columbia University, and has been a visiting professor and lecturer in India, South Korea, Spain, Mexico, France, and the United States. His articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Journal of Democracy, New Republic, and the Los Angeles Times. And his latest book is called Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, The Art of Leadership from Machiavelli to Malcolm X. And in this book, he helps readers grapple with the nature of leadership from a historical perspective. And I'm excited to have him on the show to learn lessons from history that can help a modern world that is desperate for good leadership. So Moshik, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Hey, it's an honor to have you, and I love this idea of learning leadership from a historical perspective and looking at leaders in the past and what we can learn from them. And we really haven't covered that a lot in this show over 300 plus episodes, so I'm excited to have you on board. First of all, let's just get into the book. What's the big idea behind Warriors, Rebels, and Saints?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody for listening in. It's an honor for me and a real pleasure. So the idea behind the book is very simple. So we're all in search of good leadership. We want to become better leaders ourselves, or we want our leaders to be better. We need it. We need it both to thrive personally, and we need it to live in a better society, a better world. So that we can be happy and thrive, so that our families can be happy and thrive in our communities, et cetera. And the best way to learn from that, I think, because I'm a historian, I'm a little biased, it's not from formulas, it's not just from theories, it's from actual history. Cases in the past. We're not the first people, our generation, our world, to be confronted with problems and challenges. All of our ancestors faced problems and challenges, and they had leaders. So what did they do when they confronted problems and challenges, right? What which leaders were chosen, which leaders rose to the challenge, which leaders succeeded, which leaders didn't. Those are things that we learn from looking at history. So I started teaching this as a method about 10, even 12 years ago now at Harvard University and then other places. And finally, we got the idea that maybe, as it grew and kind of became global, this teaching, that we should turn it into a book. So that would be lessons from history about leadership. So that's what the book is. It's really my attempt to convey everything I've learned in these years of teaching about leadership in history to a really broad leadership, hopefully even bigger.
So I'm curious to know, what over the years, what were your process to where you identified these historical leaders? Because there's thousands and thousands of leaders you can look at. So how did certain leaders sort of rise to the top to become featured in your lectures and in the book?
That's a great question. You're right. Any historical event, any moment in history has its leaders, right? At any given moment, there's leaders at the lower level, the higher level, in every facet of our lives. So how do we choose? Well, I chose leaders. It wasn't random. I didn't want to just take the most famous leaders or the leaders that we all heard about necessarily, although some of them are also in the book. I wanted to see what lessons we can learn. So I chose leaders and leadership cases that I think address really universal, timeless sorts of problems that we face. For example, when our society or our economy or our business is in a crisis, what kind of leadership does history show works in that kind of situation? What do people look for in a moment of crisis? Or another example is, how do you lead when, we associate leadership with power? So we think of, if you look at books in any bookstore you walk into, or you're just searching things on Amazon, you'll find a lot of books about, titans of industry or monarchs or generals or great presidents. And those are very interesting and important, and we can learn from them. But few of us are actually in that kind of position, right? Few of us are monarchs or presidents or generals or titans of companies. We have to be effective leaders in whatever situation we are. So how do you lead when you have little power? When you only have some power, but not a lot of power? Or even in some cases in history, how do you lead when you have no power, when you're in danger? When the very act of leadership, think of resistance movements in World War II, think of, networks of people trying to survive very difficult conditions. Can be conditions of warfare, can be conditions of, conflict. It can be many different kinds of situations in history. How do you lead in a situation like that? You don't have an army. You don't have people just, at your command, right? You have to find other sources of power, other ways of leading. So I guess if you look at the book, even kind of in terms of the way it's structured, it has cases that I chose that are very, I think, effective for conveying lessons for today from history.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love the fact that you say that, because I think we can be obsessed with a cult of personality of certain great leaders of the past, and we can study them and all that. But again, they had armies, they had power, right? And so I think one of the easiest ways to lead is having positional power, right? Having, I'm now the vice president of this company. I have 600 employees, right? So everyone listens to what I say. I think one of the more difficult things, as you say, is how do we do it when we have no power, and how do we influence people? So middle managers, one of the greatest jobs I ever had was a quality manager for a division. I had a small team, but I had to influence all these factories to comply with quality standards, but no one worked for me. So it was all about influence. Right. And so those jobs where you just have influence is your only power is really challenging. So I love that you touch on those leaders as well. So how do you lead when you have no power? I think that's really interesting. What are you've mentioned taking those history lessons and applying them to tackling today's problems. What are some of the today's problems that we deal with that some are timeless and some are new to us, I would imagine?
Oh, I mean, well, I guess one thing is that I'm confronted with all the time is, my students and my people that I kind of come into contact with, they tend to be on the younger side, and they're very worried about the future, John. And in all honesty, it doesn't even matter what people's politics are necessarily, what side of the spectrum they are, or even what their backgrounds is, what religion or ethnic background, and all these other things. There are things that I see in common in different countries that I go to. People are worried about the future. They feel that the future is not in their control, that they're not in control of their own destinies. And that's a theme that I encounter a lot. How do I create a world for myself and for my family in which, I'm not, I don't feel vulnerable, that I can be, I can lose everything, or I'm going to be, discriminated against, or my environment is being degraded, or, I can't afford, a lot of people can't afford what my parents had at my age. And there's all this technology that's happening too. And I think this is something very important. We have very fast moving technological progress in the world, amazing advances in science, technology. If you keep up with this stuff, it's mind blowing. But how many people can actually access that, can understand that technology? We have a lot of fear of technology, a lot of fear of progress. I think it's understandable because people often don't understand it. It's not even explained, I think, and it can be very difficult to explain these things. And so people tend to worry about, how is this technology being used? Is it something that's not for my betterment or the betterment of my family and community, but rather something that is meant to control me or harm me or exploit me? Or maybe there's other people who are really benefiting from this technology, and I'm losing out my way of life, my livelihood. And I think that if you translate this, John, into the political sphere, I don't want to get too, complex about it. A lot of the things that we've been seeing in the United States and around the world in terms of political debate is really fundamentally about these changes and how people, whether they benefit from these changes or they're fearful of these changes. And so I think this is a timeless problem. I think that the best leaders that you see even today, but certainly in history, are the ones who are able to communicate. They're able to communicate with people, not just their followers, but really to the public, teach them, help them to understand and bring them along with them. Yes. And I think that this is something which you can be at the highest level. You can be a president. In American history, one really good, and this does, again, without getting into the political ideologies or anything like that, Franklin Roosevelt was famous for being just outstanding at talking to the public, explaining his policies, explaining what was happening in the Great Depression, then explaining what was happening in World War II with his fireside chats. The man won 4 elections in landslides. And one of the reasons is because people believed in what he was saying and they found him very convincing, very compelling. That's someone at the high level. That's a president. But very often in life, as you pointed out, John, with your own experience, we're in this position where we're not at the very top. We're not at the very bottom. We've got some power. Maybe we've got people working for us. Maybe you have a team. Maybe you're heading a division. If you're in the military, you might be an officer, and you've got people at your command, but you've got people above you, right? So you've got to manage that situation, right? But even in that kind of, so you have to be able to influence. So that's communication. That's kind of having good arguments, making alliances. But it also means getting people on board with your ideas, with your program, with your agenda, getting people to believe. People follow because sometimes they have no choice, right? But it's much better when people are enthusiastic. It's better when people actually buy in. So I think that those are the leaders that really shine throughout these cases.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, the official coffee of the Deep Leadership Podcast. Salty Sailor is a veteran-owned coffee brand on a mission to deliver premium, fresh roasted coffee while making a positive impact in the world. Their motto is drink coffee and do good, which reflects their commitment to making amazing coffee and actively supporting the military community. 10% of every order goes to the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, an organization dedicated to helping sailors, Marines, and their families in times of need. All our listeners get 10% off every order of their amazing coffee by using the discount code DEEP at checkout. So check them out at saltysailorcoffee.com. This episode is brought to you by Leader Connect, a leadership training company and video platform founded by the leadership book author and Deep Leadership Podcast guest, Neil Jerd. Leader Connect is a video and podcast streaming platform for leaders and teams. Watch it alone or as a team, and each video supports you and your team, allowing you to improve performance and build a great culture. Join hundreds of experts and learn about leadership, planning, public speaking, team building, mindfulness, and a range of other subjects that will help you lead well and build a great team. I'm proud to say that I'm one of the experts on this platform. Leader Connect is offering a 10% discount to all Deep Leadership listeners. Go to leader-connect.co.uk and enter the code DEEP at checkout. Master your leadership with Leader Connect.
Life is hard, but finding a really great podcast makes the days go by so much easier. Hi, my name is Blue Telusma. I'm a writer, an emotional intelligence coach, and the host of Humanize with Blue Telusma, a podcast where we believe that when you humanize everyone in the room, a great conversation is almost guaranteed. Join us every week here on Electricast as me and my guest co-hosts unpack big topics and interview even bigger personalities with a sense of humor and a dash of mischief. If you're looking for a new best friend in your head, we've got you covered. Electricast.
I love that you say that we're in a time of significant change, both technology and just society, in terms of like we're exposed to all the news of the world at every second of the day, which is never in our history as a human species have we had that. So we're going through unprecedented or high levels of change. And I love what you say, when it comes to change, communication is really critical. You mentioned Roosevelt. We were going through a lot of change during that time with World War II, the Great Depression, and he was communicating all the way through to kind of, reassure and I think COVID-19 showed that, right? As leaders, many company leaders, we had to help our employees through this unprecedented worldwide pandemic we've never been through. I just tell people, I say, I don't really know what's going to happen because it's my first pandemic, right? It's so unprecedented, right? But we as leaders had to communicate and be present and help our employees kind of get through the next steps. And okay, this is what's happening now. We're going to get through that. So I love the fact you say the communication aspects of leadership, especially in a time of change, is really, really critical. I love that you point that out. I was just curious, looking at these historical leaders, do leaders make history, or does history make the leader? Is it the circumstances that where someone just steps up, or are there people that are out there that have made history just by their actions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I use that question actually as the focal point of my teaching and my work. It's the first thing I ask people when I meet them in conferences, lectures, in my class. I say, so, you've heard of this famous leader, right? This famous leader changed the world. Let's think of someone really significant in history, the sorts of leaders that we all learn about in school. It could be a Lincoln, it could be a Churchill, it could be a Napoleon, right? It could be Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of really famous, important leaders, and justifiably, they're famous because they did really important things. They changed the world. But how do these people even become leaders in the first place? How do you explain the creation of such leadership? You have to talk about where these people come from. What were their experiences? What kind of values did they imbibe, right? Well, what kind of maybe traumas did they go through, right? What forged their character? And so I think when we talk about really interesting leaders, we're looking both at the world that they made, right? How they changed things, but we also look at how the world made them. And it's really a back and forth. Some people have a tendency, I think, to be interested more in the leadership, right? Let's look at Churchill and what he did, right? World War II. And a lot of people are going to be interested in, wait a minute, Winston Churchill, where did he go to school? How did he grow up? Who did he meet along the way? Who were his influences, right?
Yes.
People don't just fall on us from outer space. I'm not saying that they're random, but I think that we want to understand, in the case of these important leaders, how their minds were made, how they were shaped. So I go back and forth, and John, I have no answer for you. The reason I have no answer is I think it's really both. I think that the leaders are made, but I also think that leaders make history.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, the circumstances are such that someone needs to emerge, to step up, like the civil rights movement, right? It was happening long before Martin Luther King Jr. got involved, but it is what shaped him so that he was ready for the time when the world needed him. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting to look at it from both perspectives. The world influenced him, and then he influenced the world.
I think that's right. So Martin Luther King Jr., really good example. His generation, think about, when he was a very young person, there were elderly people that he knew who had been slaves, in America. He knew them. So he's his generation was a transitional generation, and he grew up in a world as a very, very young person. He saw World War II. He saw, Black American soldiers participating in the liberation of Europe and fighting in the Pacific and fighting for freedom and liberty and democracy and fighting against tyranny and fighting against racism, Nazism, fascism, and so on. And then that generation comes home, and what do they see? They see there's still segregation. They see that there's still discrimination. They felt that there was a big problem because they themselves came home to a reality that they had supposedly been fighting against. So this is the generation of the civil rights movement. They said, no, we have to be very coherent. We have to be very consistent and fight at home for the things that we want for the entire world. And so Martin Luther King Jr. comes up in that world. And there is a choice then of, if we want equality and we want desegregation, well, how are we going to fight for it? And that was the debate. He took the side of, we're going to do it through, civic disobedience, nonviolent protest. Not everybody was on board with that agenda, but he was very committed and very determined. He had one foot in the system, and this is another lesson about leadership, that leaders have to choose when they're going to work with authorities, when they're going to work with existing institutions, and when they're going to fight outside, going to create something new, or maybe try to take down what exists. So he was very clear with when he dealt with President Lyndon Johnson or any of the other sort of politicians who were leading the country at the time. He said, I'll work with you, but I'm not going to compromise on what we consider to be the fundamental, fierce urgency of now, which you called, right? That there are going to be civil rights, and we're going to do it the easy way or the hard way. And he said, we got to do it. We should try to do it the easy way, as it were, through nonviolent civil disobedience. So I think that Martin Luther King Jr. is a great example of someone who saw the world and was forged by that experience of his generation, what he saw as a young man, the lessons that he learned from that, and then taking it and making that change that he thought was necessary.
Yeah, I love it. And he's an example of someone that was without power and led through influence, led millions of people through influence. And
absolutely.
And so I love that. Are there others, you mentioned that in desperate times, unlikely people emerge. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. is an example of an unlikely leader. Are there other examples that you can think of that are sort of the unlikely leaders that emerge from a crisis?
Yeah. So actually, John, it occurred to me as we were talking about Roosevelt. I don't know how many of your listeners are acquainted. It's south of you, there is the state of Louisiana, and the state of Louisiana, one of its most famous sons was Huey Long, the former governor of Louisiana, and in the early 30s, and then he was senator from Louisiana. Here's a very unlikely, but he was a lawyer, small town lawyer, who rose to power in Louisiana. Behaved like a dictator in that state, by the way. He really kind of just had his way with all the institutions. And because the United States was in such a crisis in the 1930s, he actually rose to national fame as a potential leader. If he hadn't been assassinated in 1935, because that's what happened to him in the end, there's talk of, if Roosevelt hadn't done a lot of the things he had with the New Deal, that we would now all be studying in school about Huey Long, who was a very unlikely person to kind of emerge to power, because he was very critical of of the economic system, and he wanted to have a sharing of wealth, and he was beloved by poor people all over the United States. Extremely popular politician. But what saved the institutions, as it were, at that time was the fact that Roosevelt was also very popular among poor people in the country, even though Roosevelt was, you probably know, was like an American aristocrat from Hudson Valley up in New York State. Grew up in a very sheltered, privileged environment. His wife, also Eleanor Roosevelt, they came from the same place. They were cousins. But the fact that we had Roosevelt as president really kept those institutions going and kind of prevented the United States from going down that road that we saw European countries doing in the 1930s as a result of the Depression. So it's really interesting how history works that way, right? Huey Long is a very unlikely leader. And I can't help but think about, President Trump. He's not, I have to say, President Trump is not in my book. I wanted to avoid that topic at all costs because I feel like it's all saturated, and that's everybody's been talking about for the past 9 years. But that's if you told people, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago that he'd be president and then he'd run again and maybe become a president again, I think people would be very surprised. He seemed like an unlikely person, right, to become a president. And I think that it's, again, whatever one thinks of the individual, I think it's really the result of the times, right? The sort of environment, political, social, economic environment that we've had in the United States for the past few decades. You can't explain the arrival of a New York businessman. He was really a TV personality. That's really was his main activity as he became a public figure to the highest levels of public office, the most powerful man in the world. So I think that, it's sometimes difficult to do, but we got to sometimes step aside, kind of look at the events and say, wow, put this in perspective. I did not see this coming. And we have to really understand how these unlikely figures come about, and we have to explain it through the changes that happen in our society and our country.
Yeah, I love that you point that out, because I think, I don't have a dog in the fight, but I don't get too political. But what's just interesting is, someone in my 50s, I've known Trump my whole life. He's been a character that you've heard about, your whole life, and different things he's working on, or marriages he's had, or TV shows, whatever. He's been always in the public sphere. Right. And celebrity.
He's been a celebrity.
A celebrity, right. But I never in my, a million years would think that he would become president and be such a polarizing figure. And one of those interesting things, like Roosevelt, he comes from wealth, but yet now he's trying to communicate to the working man, which is really interesting. Like he's sort of taken that same page, if you will. And it's like, what does the billionaire New York real estate guy know about the working man? Well, he communicates and he speaks their language. And it's interesting how he's using that. The unforgotten man is his, he communicates well to them, which is, I think other politicians have sort of missed out on that, this unforgotten American,
I think that I have to say, I kind of hesitate to talk about the political side of things, but just as an observation, I always thought that even the first time he ran, his most effective moments was when he would make observations about the political system.
Yes.
And about, especially in the Republican Party. I mean, that was really when he just kind of ran ramshot over the whole Republican Party, was because he would be on the debate stage just talking about how he knew them and gave them money, and he had known them for years, and just I think the public was so stunned by this sort of inside baseball that he was giving them that it was very compelling. He didn't exist in this insular political world. And I think the public saw something which made them, for, whether you agree with that or not, their representative, at least part of it, not everybody, but, enough people to vote for him, right? So I think, again, to go back in history, we see cases, this is just in politics, but you also see it in other kinds of situations. I have a whole chapter, John, about the Vietnam War, and we know that Robert McNamara was a very important person in government in the 1960s. He was Secretary of Defense. Also came from a very modest background. I don't know if people know this, but he wasn't from an old boys network. He came from a kind of a modest, poor Irish family in California. Came up what they call meritocratically, just did well at school. He couldn't afford it, got into Stanford, couldn't afford to go, went to Berkeley because it cost $50 a year. Can you imagine back then? And then he winds up being the person who's considered the best and the brightest in the country, gets appointed by John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, to be the Secretary of Defense. And he eventually winds up as sort of the architect of the Vietnam War, which is widely considered to be an unsuccessful, a disastrous war in many ways for the United States and for the United States establishment. So to go through that story is very, very interesting because, again, Robert McNamara is both a product of this sort of opportunity, this society which can be very dynamic in giving people who didn't have much of a background, a chance to grow. But then once you have that power, and that's the power to whisper in the president's ear, and the president listens to you, and you really have, the president says, this man knows what he's talking about. He's the smartest guy in the country, and I'm going to, follow his advice. That's a very unique position of leadership to be in. And I tell my students, you're much more likely to wind up in the position of a Robert McNamara than a Lyndon Johnson. Now, some of you somebody might get elected president, but how many people are actually elected president, right, compared to the population? A lot of us are going to be in positions of giving advice, being at the number 2 or number 3 or number 4, being in that mid-level, right, where you have the responsibility to get things right. And so I think a lot of the leadership, the mistake that people make is, I'm going to read about how Napoleon, invaded Russia and failed there. Well, that's interesting, but very few people are Napoleon or even in a comparable situation.
Right,
it's really interesting to see what people do as they just live their lives, right? And they try to get ahead. They try to succeed. They try to provide for their families. That's what most of us are trying to do. We're trying to live good lives. We're trying to be good parents, good spouses. We're trying to contribute to our community, and we're hopefully trying to leave the world a better place than we found it in any way we can. That's leadership.
I love that. And any one of us could end up in a situation where we could change the world. So we may be in that position where, like you said, we're not the number 1, but we might be the number 2 or 3 person giving advice to someone that's changing the world. I mean, look at, I think emerging, Elon Musk with all the technology that's happening, like suddenly there's this guy that is, where did he come from? And suddenly he's helping us understand technology in a way that's, okay, maybe this technology isn't that difficult for us to understand. I trust Elon. Maybe it's okay, this AI stuff, or what does Elon have to say? So it's interesting because who was he 10 years ago? Nobody, right? I mean, nobody knew who he was. And suddenly he emerges as someone who's helping us understand technology and helping us through this weird time that we're going through. Yeah.
The other side of that, John, is, of course, of course, you're right that, we have these people who are promoting technology and they're But we also have to, live in a world in which we're aware of who has all the power or who has a lot of the power. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be about Elon Musk, but if you take these figures who are not exactly political leaders, we didn't elect anybody, they're not appointed.
Yeah.
They are, because of the way our society is structured, they have a lot of power and a lot of influence. So do we kind of just follow them wherever they may lead us, or do we want to have some accountability? Do we want to understand what they stand for, what kind of world they're proposing to us? So I guess part of my suggestion strenuously to people is to be aware of these changes. Don't just go along for the ride, but try to understand, and even don't hesitate to be critical when you have to be critical, because, usually things are a mix. A figure like Elon Musk, if you look at what, what a Tesla is, it means that, this is a technological contribution, but a technological contribution is different from a political viewpoint. A political viewpoint is something that you can debate separately. Yeah, so I always say, okay, let's be reasonable. Let's be hopeful. Let's give credit where credit is due, but let's also remember that we are all, we're all equal. We're all, members of the society, and we all should have a voice.
I love that. Have a questioning and curious attitude, and don't just take everybody for their word. I love that. It's
absolutely.
In general, in life, is going to treat you well. So, what final message would you like to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, that's I think at the very end of the book, and I actually get asked this a lot. People say, "Who are your favorite leaders today?" And I actually don't. I leave people a little frustrated. I say, I'm not going to give you like random names of somebody in the world. I say, look around you, try to identify around you who is the leader that you've seen that people don't know about. It could be somebody in your community, it could be someone in your family, it could be someone no one's ever heard of or very few people have heard of, and could be somebody very young. Try to support and rally around that person. Try to encourage that person, or try to even get other people to be aware of that person. We have good leaders up and coming. I see them all the time. I meet them all the time. And the last message is, don't hesitate to be the leader yourself. Don't just wait for leaders to show up. If they show up, that's great. If you think you've identified the good leader, then, that's excellent. But if you have an opportunity to make a change for the better. And that's really what leadership is. Leadership for me is it's not necessarily winning, making a lot of money. Those things are great, but I don't think that's what leadership means. I think leadership means service. Leadership means helping. And leadership means positive change. So I think wherever you can make that happen, wherever you find that you have that influence, then you can become the leader yourself, and you should become the leader yourself.
I love that. That's such great advice. That's so powerful. There's a Lisa Haisha quote that says, the greatest leaders don't set out to become a leader. They set out to make a difference. And I think that if we have that attitude towards leadership, is that we step up because we know we can make a difference. That's the kind of leaders we want to be in our lives, and I think we want to follow those type of leaders who are trying to make a difference, not just trying to make some money or make some sort of some sort of leadership, political stance or whatever. It's the ones that are trying to really truly make a difference, and I think that's what we try to teach on this podcast. And you brought a great perspective, Moshik. I appreciate that. How can people find out more about you and this new book?
All right. So the new book is called Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, The Art of Leadership from Machiavelli to Malcolm X. It's out. It's in your bookstores. The hardcover is out now, and the paperback will be out later this year, I believe. And I have a website. It's very simple. It's Moshik, my name, moshiktemkin.com. And there's a way that you can get in touch with me there, very straightforward. And I encourage people actually to reach out, especially if you read the book and you have questions about anything in it, anything that intrigues you. I'd love to hear from my readers and from listeners. Don't be shy.
Absolutely. We're going to put links in the show notes for all of Moshik's resources. And again, I highly encourage leaders. I tell you, we should be reading at least one book a month. This will be the book this month. If you're looking for the leadership book, let's look at this one: Warriors, Rebels, and Saints. Let's learn from history, from the lessons from history that we can apply today in our own personal leadership journey. And we can find a lot of great lessons. Moshik shared some of them on this podcast. There's so many more in the book, and I highly encourage you to go follow the link in the show notes right here. Get this book, and you're going to be a better leader for it. Moshik, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge on this important topic.
Well, thanks, John, for having me, for the great questions, and thanks to everybody for watching and listening.
Thank you again. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.
Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and updates, please visit our website at www.deepleadershippodcast.com or johnsrennie.com. Until next time, take care.
Everyone has heard about the U.S. space program, but what is actually going on at NASA? Get the real story in 4 minutes or less with the NASA Daily Podcast from Electricast. Join astronauts and researchers as they conduct groundbreaking experiments, work on the International Space Station, and reach for the stars. NASA Daily, your cosmic update.
Electricast.
Hi, I'm Mark.
And I'm Peter.
We're the founders of Electricast Media, bringing you great podcasts like Nightmare Road Stories, Tech Talk Revolution, and Bodacious Minds.
Electricast networks include Ruby for female empowerment, the Best Business Network, and GPN for geopolitics. We built this company to create community and amplify diverse voices, and we really appreciate your support.
So, keep listening to Electricast podcasts and hear the culture.
Electricast.